A metrical psalter is a kind of Bible translation, a book containing a metrical translation of all or part of the Book of Psalms in vernacular poetry, meant to be sung as hymns in a church. Some metrical psalters include melodies or even harmonizations. The composition of metrical psalters was a large enterprise of the Protestant Reformation, especially in its Calvinist manifestation, biblical basis. During the Protestant Reformation, a number of Bible texts were interpreted as requiring reforms in the music used in worship. The Psalms were particularly commended for singing. James chapter 5 verse 13 asks, "Is anyone happy? Let him sing songs of praise." Colossians chapter 3 verse 16 states, "Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom, and as you sing psalms, hymns and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God." Quote, in the preface to his edition of the Greek New Testament, Erasmus wrote, "I would have the weakest woman read the Gospels and the epistles of St. Paul. I would have those words translated into all languages, so that not only Scots and Irishmen, but Turks and Saracens might read them. I long for the ploughboy to sing them to himself as he follows the plough, the weaver to hum them to the tune of his shuttle, the traveller to beguile with them the dullness of his journey." The Reformers, taking the cue from these scriptures and from Erasmus, shared a common interest in scripture that would be singable. Various Reformers interpreted these texts as imposing strictures on sacred music. The Psalms, especially, were felt to be commended to be sung by these texts. A revival of Gregorian chant, or its adaptation to the vernacular, was apparently not considered. Instead, the need was felt to have metrical vernacular versions of the Psalms and other scripture texts, suitable to sing to metrical tunes and even popular song forms. Following the regulative principle of worship, many Reformed churches adopted the doctrine of exclusive psalmody. Every hymn sung in worship must be an actual translation of a psalm or some other biblical passage. Some Reformed churches, especially the Calvinists, rejected the use of instrumental music and organs in church, preferring to sing all of the music a cappella. Even today, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America, the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, and other Reformed churches of the Scottish tradition maintain this practice. The psalters themselves. During the pre-Reformation days, it was not customary for lay members of a church's congregation to communally sing hymns. Singing was done by the priests and other clergy. Communal singing of Gregorian chant was the function of professional choirs, or among communities of monks and nuns. John Calvin, inspired by Erasmus's comments, desired singable versions of the Psalms and other Christian texts for the communal use of the Reformed churches. The French metrical psalter, one of the greatest metrical psalters produced during the Reformation, the Genevan psalter, was authored for the Protestant churches of France and Geneva. It has been in uninterrupted use to the present day by the Huguenot and other French-speaking Protestant churches. The texts of the French psalter were brought together from two independent sources, the poet Clement Marot and the theologian Théodore de Bèze. Marot and Bèze's psalms appeared in a number of different collections, published between 1533 and 1543. In the latter year Marot published Cinq Cantions, a collection of 50 psalms rendered into French verse. The full psalter containing all 150 canonical psalms, plus the Gospel Canticle, Cantique de Simeon, appeared in 1562. The French psalms were set to Gregorian Gregorian and popular, secular, sometimes unpublished melodies that were harmonized and altered for congregational singing. Music for the Genevan Psalter was furnished by Lois Bourgeois and others like Guillaume Franck and a certain Maestre Pierre. The composer Claude Gaudemel harmonized these melodies with great variation in the complexity of the music. In some cases each part matches note for note, while others are contrapuntal or even motets. Even more elaborate musical arrangements were composed in the 17th century by Pascal de l'Estacart and Jan Peter Sohn-Sweeling. An example of the Huguenot Psalter is Psalm chapter 24 from the French Psalter, Le terre au Seigneur appartient sequens a ronde conscient, aceux qui habitant en elle, sur mer fondements lui donna, le enrichet et le environne de mainte rivière très belle. The Dutch Metrical Psalter. A metrical psalter was also produced for the Calvinist Reformed Church of the Netherlands by Protestant Reformation in 1566. This psalter borrowed the hymn tunes from the Genevan Psalter and consisted of a literal translation of Marot and Bez's French translation. The Dutch Psalter was revised on orders of the Dutch legislature in 1773, in a revision which also added non-paraphrase hymns to the collection. This Psalter also continues in use among the Reformed community of the Netherlands, and was recently revised in 1985. In 1968 a new metrical psalm book appeared, which is incorporated in the Dutch hymn book, Liedboek voor de Kerken of 1973. Metrical psalters in German. The Genevan Psalms were translated into German by Ambrosius Lobwasser in 1573, Psalter des Königlichen Propheten Davids, and were sung a cappella to Gaudemel's harmonies for over 2 centuries. The Lobwasser Psalms are still in use in the Amish congregations in North America, who took them with the Swiss hymn books of the New World. The music edition of 1576 was reprinted in 2004, which was a result of the International Psalm Symposium in Emden. In 1798 the German pastor in Den Haag Matthias Jorassen gave out his Nieuwe Berijming der Psalmen, which replaced the old-fashioned psalm book for nearly 200 years. The present hymn book of the Evangelical Reformed Churches and the Old Reformed Churches of Germany contains the complete psalter with many psalms, of Matthias Jorassen and other authors. It was an important decision of the synods to retain the psalms in the hymn book with the Genevan tunes. The need and interest in the complete Jorassen Psalter led to different new editions in 1931, 1951 and 2006. The last one was given out for singing of the people and not for scientific use only. Today, psalms make up a quarter of the Protestant hymn book from 1998 in German Switzerland. Metrical psalters in English. Robert Crowley, the first complete English metrical psalter and the first to include musical notation, was the Psalter of Dore, newly translated into English metre in such sort that it may the more decently, and with more delight of the mind, be read'n Song of Almen, printed in 1549. It was the work of Robert Crowley and was printed by him, Richard Grafton and or Stephen Meadman. Crowley's Psalter is a rare example of two-color printing in this era, which makes it to visually resemble medieval manuscript psalters. Contains 65 psalm tunes. Crowley also included a calendar for calculating feast days as in the Book of Common Prayer, to which Crowley's Psalter appears to be intended as a supplement. The music provided in Crowley's Psalter is similar to the Gregorian tones of the Latin Psalm Rite Psalter, and it can be found in Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians. A single note is given for each syllable in each verse, in keeping with Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's mandate for the Reformed Edwardian liturgy. The goal was to emphasize simplicity and to encourage attentiveness to what was being sung by omitting complex vocal ornamentation. In addition to the Psalms, Crowley's Psalter includes English versions of the Canticles Benedictus, Magnificat, Nunc Dimittis, and Benedicite, as well as the Te Deum and the Quicumque Vult. These are the Cantica Prophetarium retained in the Book of Common Prayer from the Sarum Psalter, key parts of the Divine Office. Crowley's lyrics are mainly based on Leo Jude's Biblia Sacrosancta, which was in turn a fresh translation from the Hebrew that maintained fidelity to its lyrical arrangement. Crowley rendered all the psalms in simple iambic 14ers which conform to the single, short, four-part tune that is printed at the beginning of the Psalter. From Crowley's rendition of Psalm chapter 24, "The earth and all that it holdeth to the Lord belong, the world and all the dwell therein, as well the old as young. For it is he that all the seas hath founded, and that the fresher waters had the same prepared." For the sake of comparison, here is how the same text is rendered in contemporary English Bibles. "The earth is the Lord's, and all that therein is, the compass of the world, and they that dwell therein. For he hath founded it upon the seas, and prepared it upon the floods. The earth is God's, and all that therein is, the world, and they that dwell therein. For he hath laid the foundation of it upon the seas, and he hath set it sure upon the floods. The earth is the Lord's, and all that therein is, the world, and they that dwell therein. For he hath founded it upon the seas, and established it upon the floods. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world, and they that dwell therein. For he hath founded it upon the seas, and established it upon the floods." Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. Thomas Sternhold published his first short collection of 1913 Psalm between mid-1547 and early 1549. In December of 1549, his posthumous such Psalm of Daw does Thomas Sternhold did in his lifetime draw into English meter was printed, containing 37 psalms by Sternhold and, in a separate section at the end, 7 psalms by John Hopkins. This collection was taken to the continent with Protestant exiles during the reign of Mary Tudor, and editors in Geneva both revised the original texts and gradually added more over several editions. In 1562, the publisher John Day brought together most of the psalm versions from the Genevan editions and many new psalms by John Hopkins, Thomas Norton, and John Marquant to make up the whole book of Psalm, collected into English meter. In addition to metrical versions of all 150 psalms, the volume included versified versions of the Apostles' Creed, the Magnificat, and other biblical passages or Christian texts, as well as several non-scriptural versified prayers and a long section of prose prayers largely drawn from the English form of prayers used in Geneva. Sternhold and Hopkins read almost all of the psalms in the common or ballad meter. The versions were quite widely circulated at the time. Copies of the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter were bound with many editions of the Geneva Bible, and the versions of the Psalms were used in many churches. The Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter was also published with music, much of it borrowed from the French Geneva Psalter. One setting from the collection that has survived is the metrical form of the Psalm chapter 100 attributed to William Kempth, with the tune known as the Old 100th are often used as a doxology. "All people that on earth do dwell, sing to the the Lord with cheerful voice, him serve with fear, his praise forth tell, come ye before him and rejoice. In 1621, Thomas Ravenscroft published an expanded edition of the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter. Ravenscroft's edition added many more psalm tunes, some of which had been composed since the original publication by leading late Tudor and early Stuart English composers such as Thomas Morley, Thomas Dallas, John Dowland, and Thomas Tomkins. Another musical contributor to this volume was John Milton, Sr., the father of the poet of that name. By any objective measure of circulation, Sternhold and Hopkins's Psalter was a success. As a separate volume, it was reprinted more than 200 times between 1550 and 1640. In addition, the Psalms in this form were included in most editions of the Geneva Bible, and also in most versions of the Book of Common Prayer. They continued to be in regular use in some congregations until the late 18th century. Literary opinion after the 16th century, on the other hand, was decidedly negative. In his 1781 History of English Poetry, British poet laureate Thomas Warton called the Sternhold and Hopkins Psalter obsolete and contemptible, an absolute travesty, and entirely destitute of elegance, spirit, and propriety. Quote, in 1819, Thomas Campbell condemned their worst taste, and flat and homely phrasing. Sternhold and Hopkins render the beginning of the 24th Psalm in this way: the earth is all the Lord's, with all her store and furniture, yea, his is all the work, and all that therein doth endure. He hath fastly founded it above the seas to stand, and placed below the liquid floods, to flow beneath the land. Other versified psalms in English. During the period of the English Reformation, many other poets besides Sternhold and Hopkins wrote metrical versions of some of the psalms. The first was Sir Thomas Wyatt, who in around 1540 made verse versions of the 6 penitential psalms. His version of Psalm chapter 130, the famous De Profundis Clamavi, begins, from depth of sin and from a deep despair, from depth of death, from depth of heart's sorrow, from this deep cave of darkness deep repair, to thee have I called, O Lord, to be my borrow. Thou in my voice, O Lord, perceive and hear my heart, my hope, my plaint, my overthrow. Sir Philip Sidney made verse versions of the first 43 psalms. After he died in 1586, his sister, Mary Sidney Herbert, the Countess of Pembroke, completed the translation of the final 2/3 of the Psalter. Together they used a dazzling array of stanza forms and rhyme schemes, as many as 145 different forms for the 150 psalms. The Sidney Psalter was not published in its complete form until the 20th century, but it was widely read in manuscript, and influenced such later poets as John Donne and George Herbert. Later English metrical psalters. Later writers attempted to repair the literary inadequacies of the Sternhold and Hopkins version. The Bay Psalm Book, the first book published in the British colonies in America, was a new metrical psalter. In 1650, the Church of Scotland produced a Scots metrical psalter. This showed some improvements, but ballad metre remained ubiquitous. The earth belongs unto the Lord, and all that it contains, the world that is inhabited, and all that there remains. For the foundations thereof he on the seas did lay, and he hath it established upon the floods to stay. Nicholas Brady and Nahum Tate produced a new version of the Psalms of David in 1696. Their Augustan version shows somewhat more polish than the 17th century versions. This spacious earth is all the Lord's her fullness is, the world, and they that dwell therein, by sovereign right are his. He framed and fixed it on the seas, and his almighty hand upon inconstant floods has made the stable fabric stand. as did Isaac Watts, who at long last breaks out of the ballad meter in his 1719 version. Though he takes considerable liberties with the biblical originals, this spacious earth is all the Lord's, and men, and worms, and beasts, and birds. He raised the building on the seas, and gave it for the dwelling place. But by the time better metrical psalms were made in English, the belief that every hymn sung in church had to be a biblical translation had been repudiated by the Church of England. A flowering of English hymnody had occurred under writers such as Isaac Watts and Charles Wesley, but the hymns were freed from the stricture that each verse had to be a translation of a scriptural text. Attitudes towards the biblical text itself had also changed, with closer emphasis being paid on its exact phrasing. This new regard for the letter of the biblical text diminished the appeal of the psalters' previous versions. Those who sang them no longer felt they were singing scripture. The success of these newer hymns has largely displaced the belief that each hymn must be a direct translation of scripture. Now, many hymnals contain biblical references to the passages that inspired the authors, but few are direct translations of scripture like the metrical psalters were. Metrical psalter in Gaelic. The Scottish Gaelic psalter was produced by the Synod of Argyll. By 1658, the first 50 psalms had been translated into ballad metre due to the work of Dugald Campbell, John Stewart and Alexander MacLean. A manuscript of the final 100 psalms was produced in 1691 with the entire Gaelic psalter, with revisions to the first 50 being produced in 1694. The Gaelic metrical psalms are used to this day in the Scottish Highland Presbyterian churches, where the practice of lining out is used. In accordance with the Westminster Assembly of Divine's Directory for Public Worship, the corpus of tunes has shrunk over the years, with only about 24 in general use. Modern-day metrical psalters. Many churches continue to use metrical psalters today. For example, the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America produced psalm books based on the Scots metrical psalter, with the intention of making the words more modern and the translation more accurate. These were produced in 1889, 1911, 1920 and 1929, 1950, and 1973, called the Book of Psalms for Singing. A further revision has been undertaken by the RPCNA, again for the purposes of making the words more modern, and also to replace some of the more difficult-to-sing tunes, such as Psalm 62b, with tunes that are easier to sing. The new edition, the Book of Psalms for Worship, was released in 2009. The Reformed Presbyterian Church of Ireland, however, produced a split-leaf version of the Scots metrical psalter, but with additional alternative versions of the words included as the second half of the book. These were culled from a number of sources, including the RPCNA books mentioned above. Whenever a new version was necessary, they merely expanded their old book, without removing any of the old translations. One of these editions was produced in 1979. They were available in Star for Sol FA. A revised psalter in more modern idiom was published in 2004 under the title The Psalms for Singing. The Melbourne congregation of the Presbyterian Church of Eastern Australia produced the complete Book of Psalms for Singing with study notes in 1991. Music in staff format is provided in a variety of meters to mostly established tunes. The texts draw from the best of older versions but providing much new material with an emphasis on accuracy. The Free Church of Scotland published Sing Psalms in 2003, being a completely new translation. It is available in words only, and in Staff and Sol FA split-leaf formats. The Canadian Reformed churches have published and Sing from Book of Praise, the Anglo-Genevan Psalter, containing English versifications for all the Genevan tunes. In 2015, Premier Printing published New Genevan Psalter psalter, which consists of the 150 psalms as found in the Book of Praise, as well as the 10 commandments and the songs of Mary, Zechariah and Simeon. Split-leaf psalters. A split-leaf psalter is a book of psalms in metrical form, in which each page is cut in half at the middle, so that the top half of the pages can be turned separately from the bottom half. The top half usually contains the tunes, whereas the bottom half contains the words. The tune and words can be matched by matching the meter. Each meter is a specification of line length and stressed syllables. If a tune is in common meter, any set of common meter words will go with it.